Elwyn Martin stood looking at this warrior who had shown up outside of his tent, the tent where he and his two fellow missionaries had been praying all night, asking God to show them what to do because nobody would sell them land in the Taree Valley. And now this warrior was telling Elwyn, come with me. Sneak out of your tent and come with me. Don't even tell your other your missionaries. Don't even tell the interpreter to come. You come with me. And Elwyn sent up a prayer-o. What's a prayer-o? A quick prayer, a prayer arrow. All right, God, if this is your answer to my prayer, protect me. I'm going to follow this man. And he followed the warrior, and the warrior led him hiking off into the jungle and over a couple hills and down another turn through a little valley until they came out into a place where there was what seemed to be the best land so far to be able to build a mission headquarters. I mean, it had everything they would want. It was near water. It was really flat and level. There were just only a few trees in places, so it would be nice to be able to prepare the grounds for gardens and buildings. And Elwyn looked at the warrior and said, you'd sell this to us? Yes. Okay, Elwyn thought, that's what they've always said before, all the other villagers, but this man had me sneak out here. So maybe it'll be a secret. And the warrior said to him, I sell it to you, but you keep secret for 3 days. Because remember, in 3 days they had to show up at the government office to sign the papers together. And he said, you keep this secret for 3 days, tell no one. Elwyn said, okay, I'll keep it a secret if you keep it a secret. 3 days later, Elwyn showed up at the government office with his fellow missionaries and with the interpreter and with the Kiop, the local police officer, and the government official was there, and they had all the paperwork ready, and the warrior showed up too with a couple other of his companions, and they all showed up, and the government official said, okay, so we need to see on the map what's the land you're selling. And they started giving instructions on how they got there, and the government official looked at the map and figured it out, and he said, here, you're selling this land here along the river right here? And the warrior said, yes. He said, so then you're representatives of the big chief who owns this area? Yes. And you want to sell this area to the 7 days mission? Yes. And Elwyn said, what's wrong? I don't understand why you're asking so many questions. The government official said, this is the best land in the area. You don't understand. Everybody wanted to buy this land. Every other church that's in a mission group here wanted to buy that land, and they would not sell it to them. They refused. But everyone knew it was the best place for mission property. How come you are selling it? He asked the warrior. The warrior said, my chief saw when other church missions came, and he told us every time, go down and you watch them, and you look and see. If they are the missions that comes from Turama Valley, along the Turama River, and they are from the mission that helps people change their lives with the stories so that they have better lives, where they don't smoke cigarettes and they don't live in ways that make them sick, those are the ones you sell that land to. And the warrior said, we waited and we saw other church missions come and other church missions want to buy, and we watched to see what they were telling, and they told stories about Jesus, but they didn't help anybody change their lives for the better. So we waited, and now we know you are the man from the Turama River. And Elwyn realized who this warrior was talking about. The chief that had sent this man to sell them the property was the chief that 4 years before Elwyn had made a promise to. Remember the chief in the pig grease? They gave him the big hug and said, you come walk 10 days and tell my people the story? That was the chief that had been waiting now, expecting for 4 years that Elwyn would keep his promise. And Elwyn's promise could now be kept because that chief had waited to sell that land until he knew the right people had come. God had prepared the way. God had prepared the way by keeping God's promises. God's promises were faithful. God kept his promises, and that helped Elwyn to keep his promise to the man, to the chief. And they were able to build a beautiful mission headquarters there. It became the headquarters for the entire region of Papua New Guinea for the 7 days. And because of that, the chief and many, many of his thousands of villagers were baptized. Other people were standing as well for God and his promises. One person we heard about a few days ago, a friend of Haru, who had accompanied him and had been in the canoe and it got flipped like a matchstick, was a man named Omoa. You remember? Haru's friend Omoa. Now, Omoa had stayed in the Turama Valley region, the Turama River region, where the cannibals were. And after they had set up a base at Kumayo, and Haru had lived there, after a while they had gone upriver and made more friends. And Omoa said, I'm going to move upriver. Even though the further upriver you went, the wilder the people were and the more dangerous it was. Omoa said, I will go. Haru, you were brave enough to live here in Kumayo. I'm going up the river, and I'll take my wife and my little boy Noah with me. So they moved up the river, and the people there greeted them with friendliness because they'd already been visiting them and telling them the story. And now they were excited to see what changes would come. And sure enough, as the people attended Lotu, what was Lotu? Anybody remember what was the Lotu? Evening and morning Lotu, worship, that's right, where they would tell the stories of Jesus. The people attended, and their lives were changing, and they were getting more ideas now about how to stay clean, how to eat better, how to live better. And because of that, word started to get around that these changes were happening in that village. Now, that village was called, let me find it here because there's no way I'm going to say it without messing it up from memory. Here we go. That village was called Sumakarima. But other villages further upriver from Sumakarima heard that there were changes now because of what Omoa was telling the people, and they sent a message with a few warriors. These village, they were called by the other villages, they were called the Bushmen. They didn't really live in a village with big huts. They kind of just roamed through the jungle and made little temporary shelters. And these Bushmen sent a representative down to Sumakarima and told them, we don't like these changes we hear of. We are going to send our best warriors, and we are going to kill Omoa to stop these changes from spreading. We do not want to ever change, so we will kill him to stop this from happening. And the chief came with his villagers, and he came to Omoa, and he said, Omoa, here's what's happening, and here's what they are threatening to do. We need to know, what are you going to do? Are you going to leave us? Are you going to abandon us and let us go back to the ways that we were? Because I don't know that we can continue making these changes on our own if we don't have you here to lead us and advise us. What will you do? They will kill you. When they say they mean something, they mean it. These Bushmen are fierce. And Omoa looked at him, and he looked at his wife and his young son Noah, who was about 2 years old by this point. And Omoa looked at him and he said, no, we are standing on the promises. We will stay right here, and we will see what God will do. Just a few days later, Omoa and his wife and his little son Noah were going for a walk along the river, going upriver a little ways, and suddenly 3 girls came running down the river path to them. Bushmen are coming. We saw them. They're coming to kill you. They were a little ways away from the village. Omoa said, okay, take my son. And he picked up little Noah and handed it to the 3 girls. He said, you take my son back to the village. And my wife and I, we will stay here, and we are going to pray. We do not want the Bushmen to come down to the village and hurt anyone else. So we will stay here and pray. And if they kill us, you take care of Noah until someone comes from the mission and you give him to the mission. But we will stay here and pray. Brave. Standing on those promises. And the girls ran off with Noah. Omoa didn't know if he would ever see him again. But he and his wife knelt there on the riverbank and began to pray. And as they prayed with their eyes closed, they began to hear sounds around them. Footsteps and twigs breaking and shuffling sounds. And then, eventually, from all around them, this sound. People letting them know that they were there. And they opened their eyes, and they were surrounded by about 15 Bushmen, warriors, painted, pig grease, big feather headdresses, fierce looks on their faces, long, sharp spears, machetes, bows loaded with their arrows. And Omoa looked up at them. And what flashed into his head was something that had happened a few years before, something he had seen happen at a previous village further upriver called Sesaburuma. Something that I had told you guys about when Haru and Omoa and Koivi were going to go visit a new village, and Haru walked into a building that had a boiling pot, and Haru realized he needed to say something to greet them. Anybody remember what Haru said? This is not worth any spinning wheel points up here at all. This is just to see how good your memory is. Anybody remember what Haru said to the men that had the boiling pot? Do you remember? There was some weird, it was not in English. Yeah, it was even not in a language that Haru normally spoke. It was a phrase he had been told, yes? Yes, ow, something, yep. Okay, I'll give you one more try. Are you raising your hand? You're just stretching, okay. What popped into Omoa's mind was, oh, Haru said something, and it was understood by the people of Sesaburuma, which is further up the river. Maybe these villagers, these bushmen, since they're from upriver, maybe they know this language. He looked up at them from his knees, and he said, with a big smile on his face, Daro Mbe! And he put out his hand to do the handshake that everybody would do if they were your friend. Daro Mbe! And the men all stepped back and their eyes got big. They did not expect him to speak anything that they would understand, speak their own dialect. They also spoke the language of these downriver people. They were expecting him to talk in the language of Sumakarima, but instead he had spoken in the language of the villages up north. And of course they had to reply. They were being greeted with a phrase that had to be replied. So just like someone saying, "Hi, how are you?" They had to reply, "I'm fine." And they replied, "Daro ao." And then they all came up and shook hands, spear or machete in one hand and shaking with the other hand. And then they all stood around him, and just like what had happened with Haru, they all looked at each other and said, "He is Wantok. He is Wantok," meaning he speaks our language. And look, he's smiling. He's smiling. And the leader of them said, "We cannot kill you. You are smiling. You are friendly." And as it turned out to be, as they talked later on, Omoa learned that they had thought to themselves, these changes that are coming, there's no way any villager would ever want to change unless they were being forced to change. So certainly, this Omoa must be either a really big, mean, strong guy who forces people to change because he's strong, or he's a very powerful witch doctor and he uses puri. He uses magic and spells to get people to change. We don't want any of that, so we'll go kill him. But when they found out he was friendly and smiling, they said, well, how does he get people to change? Well, they found out because Omoa invited them back to the village and said, "Come on, I'll tell you some stories." And they stayed there for a week listening to the stories. A whole week. And then they went back upriver to tell their people. And soon enough, sure enough, they were sending invitations downriver. "Hey, why don't you come up and visit us sometime? We want to hear more stories." Another sign of how God's power could change lives. Change those angry bushmen into smiling friends. But there were times where it seemed that God's power didn't come through, where it seemed that God's power had failed, even when now would be the best time for it to work. And I want to tell you one of those stories really quickly, even though it means I'm going to run over a couple of minutes today. Because that same little boy of Omoa, what was his name? Noah. And how old was he? 2 years old. He got sick. He got sick from malaria. What insect carries malaria? Mosquitoes. Thankfully, here in the United States, that doesn't happen very often at all. But in other parts of the world, malaria is still a very big problem for mosquitoes. And he had gotten bit by a mosquito with malaria, and he got sick with it. And he didn't just get a case where you felt lousy for a few days, and you were so tired, and your bones hurt, and you had fevers, and you laid in bed. He got the worst type, which is called black water fever. Anybody remember what black water fever does? Because we've talked about this in previous years. Black water fever is when the malaria makes your liver just stop working, and so then everything that comes out of your body turns black. All of your pee is black, and everything else that comes out is black, yeah. And you die usually from this very fast. He got black water fever. All in one day, he suddenly got very sick and hot and cold and weak and pains all over, and his belly hurt and he was vomiting. He couldn't keep any fluids down. And Omoa and his wife did what they could, but they didn't have any great clinics set up here. They were just out in a village by themselves, and they tried to take care of him the best they could with hot water treatments and cold water treatments and wrapping him and holding him and singing to him and praying and claiming the promises of God that God was going to take care of him when he walked through the fire. He was hot like he was walking through fire, and they were claiming the promise that God said, when you walk through the fire, you shall not be burned, nor shall the flame scorch you. And they claimed those promises in prayer until midnight that night when baby Noah died, when 2-year-old Noah died. They just wrapped him in a blanket and left him on the bed there, and they sat in their hut the rest of that night until early morning. Omoa went out and informed the chief what happened. And he told the chief what they were going to do to have a burial. The chief, again, had never heard of this before in his village, but he agreed to do what Omoa said, and they picked out a place to be able to bury the little boy. In the meantime, Omoa went, and since he was only 2 years old, he wasn't very big. Omoa found a box. They had a wooden shipping box, and he put him inside, and he put the lid on it, and he nailed the lid down, and then they took jungle vines to make ropes, and they carried the box out to where they would dig the hole, and then they dug with just sharp sticks. It took hours to dig and dig and dig, remember? Just like at Zita's funeral, with the funeral that Zita had led at the age of 10. And they dug and dug and dug for hours until the hole was deep enough, and then they lowered the box down. And then what was the next thing? They prayed, and Omoa prayed with tears in his voice and tears in his eyes, praying that God would remember this place where little Noah lay, and that God would come and raise this little friend of his someday. And then they sang that song about standing on the promises. And then Omoa did what he had never thought he would ever have to do. He took a he took a stick, and he began dragging this dirt into the grave, and he did one big scrape, and dirt went in and fell on the box. And he did another big scrape, and dirt went in and fell on the box. And then he did another scrape, a third scrape, and that's when something really strange happened. Something so strange, something way stranger than what had happened at Zita's funeral, when she was leading that funeral, and the body, remember what the body had done? The body had suddenly shook, it suddenly twisted and moved. That's not what happened. What happened in that box was so strange, so unheard of, it caused all the villagers to run screaming off into the jungle. It caused Omoa to drop to his knees in shock. What happened was what we're going to find out tomorrow.